Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these heterodox conversations for complexity. Hello there, and thank you for your ears and your attention. We're happy to have you. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of Thought Stretchers Education, and I'm also the host of this podcast. Before we get to the content of this podcast episode, I wanted to share a few notes and updates. As always, we encourage you to go to wegrowteachers.com for our professional development services. And I'm pleased to announce that we now have thoughtstretchers.org, which is the landing page for the community that we've been threatening to launch for quite some time. It's been a painstakingly slow process, but we're getting closer and closer. What you'll find on thoughtstretchers.org is the foundational principles and concepts upon which we are looking to grow that community, as well as some places where you can sign up for the email newsletter, which will, of course, let you know when we do officially launch and any subsequent events and happenings. This is all meant to be an extension of our professional development work, and we have indeed begun working with schools on heterodoxy and helping them better understand the principles of liberal inquiry and equipping them with the tools to navigate some of these culture war kinds of issues. If you're interested in any of that, you can reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. Lastly, I wanted to let you know that the next thing you will hear is something that we've not really done here on this podcast before, and that is an advertisement. You'll be hearing the voice of Monica Guzman, who is a previous guest of our podcast and part of Braver Angels, which is my favorite grassroots depolarization organization. I urge you to check out braverangels.org, and for that matter, Monica's book, I Never Thought of It That Way. And if you think you might be interested in joining the network, please give it a listen.
Americans on opposite sides of the political spectrum don't just disagree on the issues. More and more, they can't stand one another. This partisan animosity is the crisis of our time and threatens our nation. Braver Angels is here to address this. Our mission is to bring Americans together to bridge the partisan divide and strengthen our democratic republic. But no single organization, no matter how successful, can be powerful enough all on its own to heal this divide. If our goal is really to strengthen our democratic republic, our only practical strategy is to ignite and shape a broader movement for civic renewal. That's why we started Braver Network. At Braver Network, you'll find organizations from all across the country and all across the political spectrum that even when they disagree on the issues, come together to spark this movement for civic renewal. In building this network, we commit to equal representation, not just between conservatives and liberals, independents and nonpartisan groups, but also between national and community-level organizations. At Braver Network, you'll find the whole gamut, from businesses and leadership organizations to educational and religious institutions, all committed to improving our politics and strengthening our nation. We're looking for leaders and members of all kinds of organizations who are ready to lead and take part in the movement. Joining is completely free, and the opportunities for collaboration are endless. Help turn the tides of toxic polarization. Check out braverangels.org to sign your organization up for Braver Network.
In this episode, I spoke with Jude Schwalbach, who's a policy analyst at Reason Foundation. Most of Jude's work is on the issue of open enrollment, which obviously is connected to and related to school choice. So we touched on lots of issues that sort of land in the school choice debate, and I pressed him on some things that, as you'll hear, perhaps was a little bit unfair or maybe pushy, but I thought they were relevant and interesting, and I think are important issues to consider in the school choice debate and conversation, of which, of course, open enrollment is only one part of. So talked about the importance of open enrollment for being student-centered and helping give opportunities to students who otherwise don't have as many opportunities. I asked why wouldn't schools want more open enrollment, and should schools accept any students based on open enrollment. We touched a bit on the political nature of allowing for school choice and whether schools are nimble and able to respond to the competitive pressures and some of the downstream effects when they are not. Again, I appreciate Jude's willingness to be grilled a little bit in this conversation because I think they are important issues. And as always, I hope you enjoy this conversation and find it helpful. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Jude. All right, I am here with Jude Schwalbach, who is going to talk with us and talk with me about open enrollment and all things related to that. He is a policy analyst at the Reason Foundation, but I'm going to give him, as I usually like to do, an opportunity to say hello and introduce himself and tell the folks a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Drew. Like you said, I'm with Reason Foundation, so I'm an education policy analyst there. That basically means I review states' education policies, review their laws, and look for ways that they can be improved or tweaked to make them more efficient and more student-centered overall. I've been doing this for about 5 years, and I really enjoyed it. I was actually a high school teacher for a little bit, but ended up shifting to the policy realm. But as you mentioned, I recently published a paper on K-12 open enrollment, which is about student transfers between public schools. And the paper is called Public Schools Without Boundaries 2023. So it's an update to a 22 version of the paper that was published last year. And in this paper, we look at the public school transfer laws in all 50 states and review their laws. And we adopted a metric to rate whether or not their open enrollment laws are good laws or how they can to give state policymakers ideas on how they can improve those laws. So the paper really hits on 4 major points, which is, what is open enrollment? Why do families use it? What's a good open enrollment policy? And do states have good open enrollment policies? I think it'd be good to maybe talk about that. First question, what is open enrollment? And so open enrollment is, it's a policy that lets families transfer to public schools other than their residentially assigned ones. So long as this receiving school has space available for them. And before diving too deeply into open enrollment per se, I think it's good to talk about residential assignment because this is the most common method of school assignment in the nation. So public school assignments are determined by families' residences, and this often divides the communities throughout the nation. These are government-imposed school district boundaries or catchment zones that sort students often by wealth, race, or ethnicity into schools based on where they live. And I don't think most folks are super aware of this until they have kids, because they're looking at the schools around them, and then they might suddenly realize that maybe they do have access to certain schools, or maybe they're barred from other schools based on where they live. And the practice of residentially based school assignment fundamentally ties schooling to housing and property wealth. And this can be a barrier to families, depending on the school they want to attend. There's research from the U.S. Joint Economic Committee, Brookings, and other places that show that more expensive neighborhoods are typically near better schools. And so that means if you can't afford to purchase a home in certain neighborhoods, you might not have access to a school that would be a better fit for your child. And these can be like a pretty big barriers. For instance, the JEC report that I mentioned earlier, it basically said that homes and zip codes associated with highly rated public schools were quadruple the price of homes and zip codes associated with poorly ranked schools. So when that's the case, we just see that that public schools aren't necessarily really public. There's you're in a situation where people are essentially guaranteeing access based on by purchasing a home in a certain area. And the cost of tuition is hidden, maybe an expensive mortgage or high rents. And as a result, children from low-income households or those who suffer from things like historic educational redlining are less likely to have access to schools that might be a better fit to them than their more affluent peers. residential assignment is essentially siloing students into socioeconomic enclaves, and it reinforces the divisions that the Harvard economist Rosh Hedy describes as bridging social capital, which is essential to upward mobility. So K-12 open enrollment weakens these barriers, and it allows students to attend other schools other than their residentially assigned ones, so long as long as space is available in those schools. And there are two types of open enrollment. There's cross-district open enrollment, which lets students transfer to schools outside their assigned school district. And then there's within district open enrollment, which lets students transfer to schools outside their catchment area, but still inside their school district.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, so that's a good answer to one of the questions that I do think, as you said, is important. Like, what is open enrollment? What do we mean by this? Just to get a little bit of sort of background to undergird this. So tell us, so Reason Foundation, that's a more libertarian sort of, was it think tank, or I don't know how it would best be described. And then what's the connection to, I guess it's Reason Magazine is the official title. What's that? Tell us a little bit about Reason and the foundation and any connections to the magazine, just so folks kind of have a little bit of a sense of who's talking here.
Yeah, so we're both under the same Reason umbrella, but the magazine focuses on usually more issues that would be more popular in, it appeals to a broader audience usually, whereas the foundation side, we usually get more into the nitty gritty of policy, and we're the ones that are reviewing laws and providing feedback directly to policymakers. It's pro bono consulting to policymakers essentially. If they're willing to listen to us, we're willing to give them feedback on laws or proposals on how they can improve those. And
libertarian would be a good descriptor.
Yeah. It's a libertarian think tank.
Right.
So in the K-12 space, that means we're looking for solutions that are student-centered, and ensure that students have opportunities to pursue schools that are the right fit for them.
Right, sort of free market kind of being one of the major drivers there.
Absolutely.
And what did you teach in high school?
I taught Western Civ 1 to freshmen, and what was the other ones? It's been several years. Government and economics to seniors. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. So open enrollment being cross district or out of district, and one of the ways in which we connected was there was, if I'm remembering correctly, some sort of maybe it was the paper that you referenced, I'm not remember exactly, but I had mentioned something about being in Kentucky, which of course is where I am, and as we were talking before I hit record, that's where you grew up as well, so maybe that's a good place to start. My daughters actually, and I'm an advocate for school choice, and I think we're going to talk, certainly in and around tangentially the sort of school choice kind of debate here, because open enrollment obviously is a part of that, and I exercise that choice in sending our daughters to an adjacent public school district. And so I think my question was something about whether the accuracy of open enrollment, what was in the report. And so when we look at open enrollment in Kentucky, for example, which of course every state in around the country you would see different versions of it, it as far as I understand, people can go to a school of their choice given the space and things like that. I think around the state, right? Is that like if I wanted to send my daughters to school in Eastern Kentucky, is that possible? Do you know?
So in Kentucky, it would depend on the district's open enrollment policy, but there are states that do have policies like that, like Florida, for instance. So you actually raise a really good point here, which is that like what is a good open enrollment policy? That's kind of what your question is getting at, I think. Because when we talk to policymakers, sometimes when we say, look, you need to improve your open enrollment policy, you get kind of a funny look, and they're like, wait, we already have that.
Right.
And that's because there's some good research that shows that 43 states have permit some sort of student transfer. The problem, though, is that most of those policies are either very narrow or overly deferential to school districts, which essentially make them really ineffective because of things like policies being voluntary. So, two of the metrics that we use to rate or states' open enrollment policies was whether or not they were mandatory or voluntary. Mandatory policies means that all school districts are required to participate so long as they have available seats. That means that every student that wants to transfer to that school district can, so long as seats are available at their grade level. A lot of states will have voluntary policies, which means school districts can choose to not participate if they don't want to. And we actually that's the problem. That's the problem or weakness, we would say, with Kentucky's policy. And I think a really good example of why this is a problem with a good open enrollment law is if you just look north of Kentucky to Ohio. So Ohio has a pretty robust voluntary policy where most school districts do participate, but the school districts that choose not to participate, that completely opt out. So it doesn't matter if they have space available or not; they're just not participating. Our school, oftentimes suburban school districts surrounding the largest 8 metropolitan areas in Ohio, and that means that nearby students that are assigned to nearby rural schools or that are in the inner city really don't have any options to transfer, even if those schools would have been a better fit for them. And so when I was looking at Kentucky's policy back in 2022, I was really excited because I saw that they passed an open enrollment policy, and I was excited that my home state was going to improve their law. And initially, I was pleased with what I saw, but then a few things didn't sit well with me, and so I decided to take a deeper look. And what I found was that Kentucky's law is framed in such a way that it's overly deferential to school districts, so that while all districts do have to adopt a policy, it doesn't mean that policy is to accept students. That policy can be to just not accept any students. So in that case, it's not based. The transfer applicants aren't being rejected based on for good reasons like lack of capacity. It's just that the school district doesn't want to participate in any way. And so while, as you mentioned, your daughters use open enrollment to transfer to a school that's a better fit for them, that's great. And I think as I was sifting through the school districts' transfer policies in Kentucky, I noticed that it seems like a lot of them do seem to participate, which was a great sign. But I did start running into some policies where they're just like, we're not participating. And I was like, okay, well, this clearly isn't based on capacity. You're choosing to, because you're not even considering applicants.
And why wouldn't they?
There's several reasons for that. And sometimes school districts are just content with their local population, and they sometimes don't want to risk having to serve students they might perceive as undesirable. For instance, and even some of the school districts that were participating, they had some quirky. There were some. I'm trying to think the right way to say this. There were some provisions in their policies that left me a little concerned. So there are things like wanting to review student transfer applicants' academic history before letting them transfer. Things like that, and that doesn't seem like the problem with that is that means that the school's not really open to all. It's open to those who's
being selective.
Students it's being very selective, and I think what's interesting here is that charter schools, at least in most states, are required to have a blind student selection process, and they're only going to weight students' applications in specific circumstances, like if you already have a student, a sibling enrolled, or something like that. And here we have traditional public schools that are they get to cherry pick their applicants, and that's just not a fair process or open enrollment process in any way. And so we want to make sure that a good open enrollment law ensures that it's a fair process and that it's transparent, and that students aren't excluded for superficial or discriminatory reasons. And some other ways, the other metrics we used in our report to rate a good policy actually pertain to good transparency provisions. And unfortunately, Kentucky falls short on these too, but some of them I think are just really straightforward. And as parents and educators would be like, when they hear them, like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. So things like posting your available capacity on your district website by grade level. That way parents can, if they're thinking about transferring to another school district, they can go online and see which seats are available at that time. Posting the school district's open enrollment policies and procedures online, so they would know how to do that. And unfortunately, when those sorts of transparency provisions aren't codified, it can just create a barrier and an undue burden on parents when they're trying to transfer. Another really great transparency provision, only 3 states in the nation have this, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and Kansas, is having annual reports by the State Department of Education that include really important open enrollment data. So we're talking about data about the number of student transfers, the number of rejected applicants, and the reasons why applicants were rejected. And Wisconsin has a phenomenal report that they publish each year, and they use this report, policymakers use this report to refine and modernize their open enrollment process. And they've been doing this for about 2 decades. So I'm not just making this up. And these reports, they basically just, like I said, they include key open enrollment data, and this data helps ensure that districts are only rejecting transfer applicants for good reasons, such as capacity. And I think part of what's really important about these reports is it's not just holding districts accountable for their open enrollment practices. It's also it can give districts an indicator on how they're doing. So Wisconsin's report will show not just the number of transfers, but the number of students that applied. So you can see potential and actual changes in enrollment. And if a school district is noticing that they're getting a lot of applications to withdraw from their school district, that should be an indicator to them that something's not quite right, and that the students that are residentially assigned to their school district aren't happy with the situation in the school. And it's an opportunity for the school district to sort of pivot and change course and work with families to encourage them to stay. And we've seen this occur in California, actually. There's an open enrollment policy in California, and there were some school districts that were just bleeding students and losing quite a few. And in reaction to that, they did a survey, reached out to their local community, and they're like, what can we do to get you to stay? Like, we don't want you to leave. And they got the feedback, and in response, some of the school districts were able to reduce the number of transfers leaving their district. In some cases, they even gained some of those transfers back. So I think this is an indicator that open enrollment can benefit school districts as well, because it tells them maybe when they're just not meeting the needs of their students.
So there's a couple of things that I want to threads I want to pull on with regards to sort of policies of open enrollment that schools might have and selectivity and things like that. But I'd like to linger just a little bit longer on the Kentucky piece here, not because I'm particularly interested in Kentucky, but I think it is maybe a good way to sort of unpack some of the political pieces here, because you're mentioning that in Kentucky there was some legislation passed that seemed pretty friendly to open enrollment, and then you dug a little bit deeper, and it was, I think you said, sort of deferential to school districts. And correct me if I'm wrong, the tendency, I think, towards more free open enrollment kinds of policies, school choice, certainly vouchers and things like that, all related here, tends to be that the Democratic Party legislators probably a little less interested in those kinds of policies, Republican maybe a bit more, but I'm curious of your how you sort of think about in Kentucky. I'm imagining, at least when that law was passed, that the Republican legislature or the legislature here in Kentucky was dominated by Republicans. So, what's your sense of maybe why they were more deferential to the schools and districts? And is it sort of any sort of political pressure there, or is it maybe easier to get those things that passed with that deference, or maybe sort of for lack of a better word, ignorance about the process? It seems like that is certainly a possibility with our legislators, especially when it comes to the complexities and nuance of education.
Yeah. So there's two things I want to hit on in that response. The first, I'm going to dodge your question real quick and speak nationally, but then I promise I'll return to Kentucky.
Sure.
So open enrollment is actually a pretty bipartisan issue. And so in 2023, about 6 states improved their open enrollment laws. And most of those improvements, some of which were switching to mandatory cross-district and within district policies, passed with significant bipartisan support. So this open enrollment is one of those interesting school choice policies where it's not necessarily a red or a blue issue. And we see states that are historically more purple, having really good open enrollment laws, places like Arizona, Colorado. And not that polling is perfect by any means, but some survey data indicates that usually about 70% of Republicans support open enrollment, and the same amount of Democrats usually support it as well. And it's very much supported among school-age parents. So I'm just throwing that out there because I don't necessarily want to say that you're only going to get this passed with a Republican legislature. That's just not the case. There are Republican legislatures that do pass open enrollment policies, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Yeah. And then with regard to Kentucky, open enrollment laws are tricky. And I'd say one factor is some school districts are not always friendly to open enrollment because while it is an opportunity to gain students, it's an opportunity to lose students as well. And so there was a open enrollment proposal earlier this year in Missouri where many school districts came out and were vehemently opposed to it because they were worried about losing students, especially rural ones. Interestingly, though, if you look at states that have robust open enrollment policies, and I'm not saying that was necessarily what was happening in Kentucky. I don't know the details of the political decision making on why they framed the law they did. I can make some guesses.
Sure.
But if you look at places like Arizona, where thousands of students use open enrollment each year, we actually see that small rural school districts are using open enrollment to keep the lights on. So school districts that are concerned about losing students, I think that's an understandable concern, but those competitive forces can force them to improve and get better. And in some cases, some families aren't necessarily like leaving rural districts. Rural districts use it as a way to gain students. You see that in California. Small rural school districts in California were actually using open enrollment to keep the lights on. So their local student population was declining. There just weren't as many kids in their school district anymore as there had been in previous years. And they had sort of a little bit of a campaign and started attracting students from neighboring districts. And those transfers were actually ensuring that those small rural districts weren't closing. So this, I think, can be really beneficial. And I can understand maybe some school districts that would oppose open enrollment and their apprehensions about it, but I don't think it necessarily needs to be the case that it's going to harm them. I actually think this is an opportunity for them to succeed. And I think I don't have the data in front of me, but I published a piece last month on Arizona's open enrollment data, and the number of rural school districts using open enrollment was, quite impressive. It was a significant number of students were transferring, and while we don't know the reasons why those students were transferring, we don't have data on that. Just the fact that many were was remarkable.
Well, to return to some of the threads I mentioned earlier, so the idea of open enrollment, and if I'm if I'm understanding you correctly, you're advocating for really opening up the windows and allowing lots of opportunities, right? Partially because it helps those who are in a school or in a setting based on their geography that their school isn't meeting their needs, and sometimes desperately not meeting their needs. But I guess one of my questions here is like, should schools accept any students? I mean, is that what the advocacy is for, or are there certain guidelines and things that make sense to put in place? Because I can imagine, as you mentioned, schools don't want to lose kids, but they also don't want to have to be responsible for taking on kids that one might call undesirable from behavior or for their academic achievement, and that rolls into and reflects on the school and the district, but is also a drain on the resources. And some schools might say, well, we don't have the resources financially and staff-wise and all of those things to handle an influx of kids with certain sets of needs. And I can understand how that seems like a reasonable sort of I guess pushback on having just this sort of wide open enrollment. So like how do you think about those sort of guidelines for how schools should admit or deny open enrollment applications?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the first thing I point to is that within their district, school districts are required by law to accommodate the students that resided within that district. So I think the idea that just because a kid lives on the wrong side of the street suddenly means that the school district doesn't have to serve them, that doesn't make sense to me. But I also think there can be some provisions that can be of assistance to school districts in these situations. Some of the situations you're describing, things like a lot of states that have really good open enrollment laws will include provisions like if a student's currently experiencing a suspension, or they've been expelled, they don't have to accept those applicants. But when it comes to academics, if a student is doing poorly because they've been assigned to a school that's not the right fit, maybe they don't get along with their teachers, or they are just struggling in that environment, maybe they're bullied and that's affecting their grades, that doesn't seem like a sufficient reason to reject an applicant. But another thing that you kind of mentioned was the funding component. My colleagues at Reason published a paper earlier this year on this very topic. So a key way to incentivize school districts to participate is to ensure that funding follows the student across district boundaries. And in most states, local education dollars are not following students across district boundaries. In some cases, you have districts that what we call off formula, which means they raise so much in local funds that they don't even get any state funds because they're raising so much locally. And in those situations, the school districts don't really have a financial incentive to take on new students. And in fact, research from California shows that funding portability directly affected school districts' willingness to participate in open enrollment. So having a good open enrollment law is good, but it's also good to make sure that there are good fiscal incentives to ensure that help school districts want to participate in a robust open enrollment program. And while funding portability varies by state, Wisconsin's approach to funding portability is by far the best solution that we've seen anywhere. And so in Wisconsin, they have an established statewide per pupil amount that follows transfer students to their new school districts. So last school year, that was about $8,200. And this funding amount is updated annually by the state legislature. And these students are still counted in their home district's enrollment for funding purposes, with the transfer amounts for exiting students deducted from the state aid. So this ensures revenue neutrality for the state, so they're not double counting students. But it also ensures that the home district retains a portion of funding for the students that leave their schools. And we also see this, and This is another, I think, this sort of harkens back to one of the points I made earlier about having good transparency and why that's important for students and policymakers. So I mentioned earlier that Wisconsin has a really good report tracking the reasons applicants are rejected, and how that affects various school districts. And one thing they noticed about 6 or 7 years ago is that students with disabilities were often the ones that rejected the most, or that was a very regular reason why that school districts were citing for a transfer applicant's rejection. And so sort of in response to that, they're like, well, we don't want students to be rejected just because they have a disability. That's not fair. So what they did is they increased the funding amount, that the transfer amount that follows students with disabilities, to $13,000. That's what it was for this previous school year. And it included a provision that if the actual cost of the student services exceeds this amount, the receiving school district, the school district that the student transfers to, can submit a financial statement for increased costs to the state for the second year of education for up to $30,000. And the way they view it is like, we want to give school districts incentives to serve all students.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a key way that policymakers ensuring that that funding amounts for transfer students follow students. I think that's a huge incentive for them. And I know every state's funding formula is really complicated, and it can be pretty intimidating for policymakers to consider fixing that. And I just want to mention that Wisconsin also has a really complicated funding formula. And so state policymakers decided they did not want to revamp their formula just to help these transfer students. And so they just sort of did a quick switch, sort of I can't remember the turn of phrase, but they just did a separate transfer method for transfer students that are using open enrollment to make sure that it's easy and the incentives are aligned.
Yeah. So a couple pushbacks that I can imagine and in some ways certainly resonate with me, and I'm curious how you think about these. I'm guessing you've encountered them or at least thought about them. So the idea of that sort of the money follows the student, there's some controversy there, certainly debate about whether that actually should be the case or not the case. And I can see how that might resonate in sort of both sides of that argument. One of the ways I think that it does concern me is that when a student transfers or enrolls in a new school, they need services right away, whereas the funding may not be there right away. And, so there's sort of a lag time in this situation where the school may not have the resources that it needs, especially if there's a lot of students that we're transferring. And so there's this sort of lag time issue. And in addition to that, and I think some of the things you mentioned, I think sort of dispel some of this, but that idea, and I've encountered this as again, my daughters are attending a district that is not ours, and the idea, and I've heard some people say, not necessarily about us, but the out of state transfers and that kind of thing, is that why are they paying for other kids' education, right? If it's based on property tax and things like that, then why am I, if I live here, being made to pay for the education of people coming from outside of my district? So how do you think about those two sort of, complications?
Yeah. Those are good questions. Well, I think one key thing is making sure that state funds are following. So those are funds that everyone's paying into there. And ensuring that, a significant chunk of those to incentivize school districts, an incentive chunk of the state funds are following students. When it comes to the lag time on funding, I think there are a few mechanisms that policymakers can consider in those situations. So maybe ensuring that new dollars are flowing or having open enrollment windows coincide with the times transfer students are going to be happening. So like in Oklahoma, I think they have, if I remembering correctly, they update their enrollment figures, I think in January and in June. And so having a sense for like right before you submit those new enrollment figures, what your enrollment's going to look like. But I also think school districts can be nimble. Other sectors don't know how their don't necessarily know how things are going to play out in the next quarter. And I think school districts can be nimble with their resources and figure things out. And I think if we look at other states, they have been. So about 16 states have robust open enrollment policies that include Florida, Arizona, Colorado, Delaware, West Virginia just adopted one. And these school districts have been able to navigate these waters successfully. So I'm sure there are advantages that are unique to each of their funding systems that they've incorporated into their laws to make sure that this is easier for school districts. But I certainly think those are things that policymakers can look to.
So you mentioned the word nimble, and well, I'm sure there are some schools that are nimble. And, as a matter of fact, that's part of the reason, or one of the advantages I think of the school where my daughters goes. They're K-12 all in one building, and at that size, I think helps them be a little bit more agile and nimble than very large districts where you see layers and layers of bureaucracy. But when I think of public school, public education, I don't think of the word nimble very often, right? It is not something that tends to come up in our work, professional development work with schools. It doesn't seem to be something that is particularly common in, especially the larger the school, the less sort of nimble they are. And that kind of gets to another, I think, concern that I honestly think is one worth taking on, is that idea that while I do think that sort of putting pressure, that external pressure on schools to, I guess, for lack of a better word, compete, that I don't know how well that actually works because of a lack of sort of nimble and responsiveness for a variety of reasons, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't do open enrollment. Perhaps it means that we should ask our schools to be more nimble and able to respond to those kinds of things. And perhaps both of those things are worth taking on. But when we have open enrollment or school choice or any of these kinds of things where you have kids leaving schools, coming and going, one of the things that obviously happens is that you have schools, and we've worked with them, where there can be a number of, sort of idea of churn. You've got a sort of destabilizing effect and a lack of perhaps resources and financial pieces in place because the money goes elsewhere, which again, that's a sort of competitive, that's a factor of competition. But those kids that are left behind are adversely affected. And, I know that we have worked with a school that I think was at one point the building was built for, and it was at capacity up over 500, well over 500. And at the time we were working with them, they were somewhere just over 50 students and, like 6 teachers, and certainly not a good situation for those students who are, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, left behind. So how do you all think about that as sort of policy analysts and advocacy?
Yeah. So I think that example you brought up is a good one, because it points to problems that are beyond just open enrollment. Sure, some of those students could be transferring through open enrollment, but we're also seeing that K-12 enrollments nationwide are declining, including in Kentucky. Before the pandemic, enrollment was already declining, but with the pandemic, things certainly started declining much faster and more quickly than many school districts were anticipating. And unfortunately, that school districts are, and they were already going to have to deal with this ahead of time, but they're going to have to consider right sizing, where you have student populations that no longer fit buildings, and those buildings are a burden on taxpayers, and rethinking how they're going to address those situations, especially with pandemic relief funds drying up this coming next year, I believe. So I think school districts are already need to think about right sizing as K-12 enrollments decline. When it comes to open enrollment, I think a robust education marketplace, our system is set up such that we're assigning students to schools based on where they live, and not really giving them a choice. People that can exercise choice right now are folks that can either afford to move to a good neighborhood that's near a really good public school, or send their kids to private school. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I also that it doesn't seem fair or right that we have a system that doesn't let families that can't afford to do that pick their schools. And so, again, I think school districts should let families choose where they go to school. And if families are content with their, could you say your question again, Drew? Well, I feel like I'm not answering it, and like if you could just say it again, I just need a moment to collect my thoughts. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. So, I mean, I guess the concern, or one of the major concerns, is the effect on those students that might be left behind in a school that is, let's just say, not competing very well. Like parents, for whatever reason, are perceiving accurately or inaccurately, and I think that perception and what parents value is also another part of this conversation that's worth talking about. But when you have sort of an exodus from a school, the things that go with that are in some different way, shape, or form, depending on where that school is, the funding, and the lag time, and whether it goes with the student or not, and that's context dependent, school dependent. But you also might see an exodus of teachers. You might see an exodus of, or lack of actual physical resources, or deterioration, and that's the kind of thing that we've seen. Where again, a school that was 500 plus and assumed to be sort of bustling and very full and hopefully doing well, to 50 plus students and 6 or 7 students, which actually could be a very good situation. It doesn't mean necessarily the lower numbers is that it's bad, but one can, I think, reasonably assume that there's a reason why those 450 or so students have gone elsewhere. And how do we account for, if you say the competition is a good thing over the long term, which makes some sense, in the short term and on an individual basis, that the effects are very real, right? So yeah, thinking about that.
Yeah, I know. Thanks, Drew. I appreciate that's super helpful. There are situations where, like I mentioned before, school districts are going to have to right size. So if you lose 450 students out of your 500, that means the school district wasn't doing something right. And just like any sector, if you're not doing a good job, there are going to be economic and fiscal effects. Regarding those students, that seems like a situation where it's imperative on the school district to reconsider what they're doing. And if they can't maintain a robust student body, and it'd be better for a school district, if I'm not sure if you're thinking of a school in particular or a school district at large, but either maybe consider some. You might have to start closing some schools in those situations. And unfortunately, like I mentioned before, with declining enrollment overall, that is something that many school districts are going to have to start thinking about. And no one likes talking about school closures or anything like that, and it can be really hard on communities. Which is why when school district or school closures do occur, it's really important for school administrators to be transparent with families about the situation and being really communicative with them about it. And I don't have the articles in front of me, but I've written on this before. And there are some good steps that have been effective when it comes to school administrators communicating with families on these situations. Another important thing is honestly, I don't have a really good answer to this one right now. Is transportation. Transportation is a really tricky thing when it comes to student transfers, and ideally, I would like to. I think we can. I think there are things that could be done to make the transportation situation easier, but there are a lot of, in particular, federal laws that make it cumbersome, not just on families, but on school districts and states as well. One interesting thing we did see in Wisconsin, and this is by no means like a perfect solution, but they do have a small funding amount that it's a funding pool. It's not very much, but families can be reimbursed a small amount for transportation costs when they're using open enrollment. Again, not perfect, and I would really like my colleagues and at Reason and other institutions are thinking about this and thinking about ways we can get innovative and make this easier for families. But I think there's some additional policies as well that on the transportation side that can make things easier. There are some. I don't know if this is the case in Kentucky. I don't remember. I haven't looked at it in a couple of years, but ensuring that there aren't very unnecessary barriers to transportation. So making sure that there's no laws that prohibit school districts or school buses from crossing school district boundaries to pick up transfer students. But we do know that when families really want to when transportation is an issue, families do respond to those situations. And again, I would rather this not be the case, but there are situations where there's a school bus at the edge of a district boundary, and then the families carpool over to that pickup location. That's how they do it. That happens in Colorado.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, so the transportation piece gets at, I think, one of the concerns and I think valid criticisms of the sort of marketplace and competition argument, of which I'm fairly sympathetic. I mean, I tend to find the idea of putting some pressure on schools to be competitive, whether it's that they have to compete with other schools or what that leverage point might be. But there's also, and I know we're talking about open enrollment and not necessarily about school choice, and so maybe this is unfair to continue to continue grilling you on this. Not certainly my intent, but I think it's a really, important piece here that, as you think about, and again, I think fairly resonant with me in general. Schools are not like a coffee shop or an arcade or something that is unlike a grocery store, right? So if you have a grocery store and it's the only grocery store in the area, and that grocery store goes out of business because it wasn't able to compete with some of the other options that are further away, that those people who can go further away are obviously making a choice that they think is better, but there are some people very likely who can't get to that further option. And so, schools in some sense are more, they're not completely like the businesses that we would see in the marketplace that are subject to competition pressures. There is some sort of public good. There is some sort of element of that. And so it's not when I hear people say, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but I hear people kind of push this school choice means competition, which means better schools, and it will help everybody. There's some of that resonates with me, and again, in the sort of long term, but in the short term and in the individuals, that could be really tough if you happen to live in one of those places and your school is going away or degrading, and you don't have the resources and options to make a better choice. So there's not really a question there. And again, I'm not meaning to sort of put you on the spot and say, well, you should have a solution for this, Jude. Come on, what's your answer to this? But it does strike me as an important piece. So feel free to comment on that, or we can move on to some other pieces that I think are also important.
Yeah. I will briefly respond. And I know I mentioned earlier that school districts can be nimble, And you sort of responded by saying that I don't really think of that.
They
But I
can
think as
be,
school
but often
districts, they
aren't.
can. But I think when incentives are aligned, they most certainly can be. And we have seen this in other states. So,
And we should demand that they are more nimble.
yes, absolutely. And so if you look at Arizona, which you have Phoenix and Tucson, and I guess I don't know if you'd really call oh shoot, I forgot the name of the third city, but it's up by the Grand Canyon. Uh, uh, those are their two major metropolitan areas, and the rest of the state is extremely rural. Like there's nothing out there in some of those areas, just a few small, tiny towns,
Yeah.
And just mountains and desert. Um, and Arizona adopted open enrollment and charter schools about sometime in, I guess, it's going to say 20 years ago, but it's longer than that when I consider my own age. So about 30 years ago now. And they have a robust open enrollment sector and a robust charter sector. And these schools are competing with the traditional public schools. And I lived in Phoenix for a little bit, and it's wild. You can drive 10 minutes and pass 3 or 4 different schools. But the vast majority of them are charter or traditional public schools. And since that that sector exploded 30 years ago and started, I think Arizona has closed one school district, consolidated maybe another, and opened another. I don't have the figures right in front of me, but it was a very small figure. So I think that goes to show that school districts can be responsive to these competitive pressures, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that school districts will necessarily close, and that they can use these transfer students to. It's not just a matter of losing; it can be a matter of gaining. So I guess yes, there is a possibility that if a school district is doing really poorly and the vast majority of people, that it might be time for that school district or particular school maybe to close. But I think we should give our educators and administrators maybe a little more credit, because I think in other states when they've been forced to compete, that they've done so successfully.
Yeah, well, there have been certainly some examples of that, and again, it's a bit unfair to ask you to have a solution for this, because it is really complex and it is context dependent. And where there are nimble and effective leaders in leadership, I think that can certainly be the case. I guess one of the questions and problems inherent in that is that, of course, there are schools that are not nimble and there's not effective leadership, and they don't particularly respond to the competitive pressures. And so unfortunately, those kids that live there and attend those schools they obviously don't benefit from any of that. So one of the things that I'm curious if you have any thoughts about is that we talked about a bit or mentioned it before, is like parents and the parents' role in this, right? We're assuming, I think, that parents are making choices, and open enrollment is a vehicle for them to make choices, right? Now, I'm essentially an advocate for school choice, but I also get frustrated with some of the school choice movement people that seem to think that school choice is an absolute good, that it's always good, that there's never any real problems with it. And one of the things that I wish we could get to, and again, I'm curious if you've done any work on this or how you think about this, is how do we help parents better understand how to make good choices, right? It could be, and very likely is, in my opinion, and people will push back and say this is paternalistic, that we should say, well, you don't think parents know what's best for their kids. Well, I think parents in general want what's best for their kids, but when they look at a school and their test scores, does that necessarily mean that that's a better choice for them? It very likely is, but not necessarily. And one of the school choice things that I wish would be number one on the sort of every school has to be a quality school, because if we give students and parents opportunities to choose, and they choose a school that is not of high quality, again, there's the paternalistic criticisms, but if they're going to a school that's not high quality, then that seems to be a real problem. So have you kind of done any work on that? How you think about that sort of I guess educating parents and helping them understand how to make really good choices in situations where they might have open enrollment freedoms?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'd push back a little bit. I do think we should just trust parents to make the best decisions for their kids, and they're going to know how, and parents are the ones that know how to do that best. But when it comes to open enrollment specifically, we do have some data about student transfers and where they go. And I think this can give us some insights as to how parents make those decisions. So as you mentioned, test scores is a part of that, and also just how schools are rated. So we see in Texas that most transfers, or student transfers, they're headed to schools that were ranked as an A or a B, and they're less likely to transfer to schools rated as C, D, or F. And that wasn't actually, that one wasn't test scores. That's based on the state report card on school districts. In California, that was the one where they were more likely to test or to switch to schools that had higher test scores. Similarly, we see in Florida that about 90% of students transferred to schools that had higher rankings, namely A or B on the state's scorecard for them. So that's definitely part of it, but that's also not the only reason students are using open enrollment. Their families are making decisions based on other reasons as well. So part of it can be learning environments, commute times, safety, bullying, and particular school environments. So in California, while some families certainly made decisions based on test scores, we also see that families are making decisions based on whether or not their students or their kids were bullied at their assigned school, or students that wanted a shorter commute. The bus, like they could have hopped on the bus, or maybe their parents would drive them, and it was just take a long time, and they were closer to another public school that they weren't residentially assigned to, where it was a shorter commute. So families definitely use those sorts of reasons as well. We also see in California, there were reports from 2016 and 2021 which showed that families were switching because their students wanted to access specific courses, things like AP courses or international baccalaureate. Maybe they wanted to access a particular instructional model at a school, or courses that emphasized career preparation for students interested in specific fields. So if we look at, survey data on families from Florida, survey data from Florida families on how they choose school, things like test scores do come into mind, but there are other things like school environment. Do I feel like the school's teaching my kid to be a good person? Things that are aligned with our family's values. So I think families consider a wide host, an array of ideas or consider factors when they select a school. And I think families are going to make decisions that are in the best interest of their kids.
Yeah, and I think in general, you're right. I certainly don't want to imply that parents don't know what's best for their kids and or don't have their best interests at heart. I guess I just wish there was a bit more emphasis from the school choice folks, a sort of advocacy group that is really, really activist in that nature, that quality of the education. And I think probably this is a lack of leadership from on high at the highest levels of what we should insist upon with our schools as a sort of common denominator, right? And there's no doubt, there's a reason why we're having this conversation around competition. There's no doubt that there are some schools that have fallen short and continue to fall short in some of those things that we would expect our schools to deliver, and for a variety of reasons. So, well, Jude, I appreciate the conversation, and again, sorry if I've I didn't mean to grill you on saying, hey, you've got to have all the answers here for school choice activism, but I just thought it was relevant. Are there any other pieces that we haven't talked about that you think we should? And if not, what do you want to mention as far as links and things like that?
Yeah, I would definitely encourage you to check out my paper at recentfoundation.org. If you go to the education tab, it's Public Education Without Boundaries. And we have a lot of other links as well. Our research on Wisconsin in particular, I'd encourage you to check that out, both in terms of the transparency provisions that Wisconsin adopts and how their funding works as well. Another important piece that we didn't really get to talk about today is how school districts define capacity. And while school districts will say that they have a set number of kids that they can serve, I do think there's more wiggle room than we're often willing to acknowledge there, especially when we take into account that a common practice in many states is address sharing, where families lie about their address so they can gain access to particular public schools. In some states, that's a felony. You can go to prison for 10 years. It's a big deal. But families are willing to take those risks because they want their child to have access to a good school. But the fact of the matter is that they're lying about their address, and yet these schools are still able to accommodate them, even though if they find out, or if they were to find out that the student wasn't residentially assigned, they would say they no longer have capacity for them. So I think that just addresses the fact that school districts are more nimble than we're willing to give them credit for in many cases.
Yeah, and perhaps you're right. I guess that brings one quick question. How do you feel about online school? And I can imagine if I'm in, let's say, again, rural eastern Kentucky, and I have a school district that is, I don't think, meeting my needs, and transportation is obviously very difficult to get anywhere else. Maybe there's an online school in Montana that could help me. Is that something that sort of fits with your vision?
Yeah, I think, if an online school is a good fit for a student, then they should certainly be able to access it. It's not for every student. And as a former teacher, and I think most parents, every kid learns differently. And when a teacher's in a classroom, you can't meet the needs of every single student. So I think that's why it's important. If there's a mode of learning that works really effectively for certain kids, then they should be able to access that, including online schooling.
Is that pretty widely available, or is that something that most states don't allow?
It varies greatly by state. Some states will have an online charter school, like Oklahoma has that. A few other states have it as well. I'm not as familiar with that aspect of schooling, but if it's working for some kids, they should be able to access it. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, the article is Public Schools Without Boundaries, Examining Every State's Open Enrollment Policies. And you've got other pieces on reason.org. We'll link to this in the show notes, of course, and then some of the other pieces as well. Any other links, social media, or anything you want to give?
You can follow me on Twitter at Jude Schwalbach. I'm the only one.
All right. Well, Jude, again, thanks for subjecting yourself to the cross-examination. It wasn't really necessarily my intent, but I appreciate you being a good sport about it. And hopefully, as always, folks have found it helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. Appreciate it.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.